Representative Jasmine Crockett positioned herself under the glaring CNN studio illumination, with her burgundy outfit projecting a calm self-assurance as she readied herself to confront one of the nation's most intimidating legal intellectuals. Just a short time prior, Alan Dershowitz, the 85-year-old retired Harvard law academic and famous lawyer, had emerged from the wings holding a thick pile of documents with a remarkably resolute look on his face. "I possess the proof that will reveal the representative's severe deficit in judicial comprehension," Dershowitz announced to the host, keeping his tone unwavering with the command of someone who had litigated at the Supreme Court on numerous occasions. She could be an ascending talent within her political faction, yet this evening the audience will witness that she is completely overwhelmed by the subject matter. The crowd grew restless, lifting their mobile devices to capture what was guaranteed to unfold as an intensely fiery verbal clash. Armed with his many years of practice, an elite Ivy League background, and a roster of famous clients, Dershowitz seemed certain that this would serve as an effortless victory against the fairly inexperienced lawmaker who had worked in the legislature for merely a couple of years. However, Crockett remained entirely unfazed by the situation. The past court-appointed lawyer and civil liberties advocate remained exceptionally composed, letting a subtle, perceptive grin touch her lips while she locked her gaze directly onto his. She had meticulously planned for this exact clash, and anyone familiar with her personality easily identified that specific facial expression. This encounter was not destined to be a standard televised argument. Rather, it was poised to transform into one of the most difficult trials throughout Dershowitz's extensive professional life. Once the network's broadcasting equipment started recording, the anchor presented the upcoming section focusing entirely on newly proposed electoral access laws. Neither the representative nor the professor broke their line of sight throughout their incredibly fierce and unyielding visual standoff. The seasoned judicial academic was on the verge of discovering that discounting Jasmine Crockett's capabilities would ultimately serve as his most massive error on a nationwide broadcast. Prior to plunging into this extraordinary back-and-forth conversation, please ensure you thumb up this clip and follow our platform to receive additional thoughtful governmental arguments and breakdowns. You will absolutely desire to watch every single moment of how Representative Crockett completely reversed the situation against one of the country's most highly praised legal professionals. The broadcasting room hummed with palpable excitement the moment moderator Rebecca Mitchell initiated the formal dialogue. This evening, we are accompanied by a pair of judicial specialists to argue the merits of the Voting Rights Protection Act presently sitting before the legislative branch. We have retired Harvard law instructor Alan Dershowitz, who has litigated at the highest court while defending multiple prominent figures, alongside Texas Representative Jasmine Crockett, a past civil liberties advocate and appointed defense lawyer currently navigating her initial session in the federal chamber. The professor sat perfectly straight with his graying hair flawlessly styled, wearing a sharp dark blue outfit that practically radiated traditional institutional authority. At the age of 85, he bore the immense gravity of countless years within university life, having shaped entire eras of attorneys while representing individuals ranging from O.J. Simpson to Jeffrey Epstein. His facial demeanor remained entirely unyielding. He had not arrived merely to converse, but rather to absolutely overpower his opponent. "I appreciate you hosting me here tonight, Rebecca," he commenced, with his distinct northeastern regional inflection remaining quite prominent. "I have actively instructed on constitutional jurisprudence since long prior to the moment this representative was even brought into the world. I firmly believe the viewing audience merits hearing from an individual who genuinely grasps the intricate judicial nuances at play here." The sheer arrogance laced throughout his vocal delivery was utterly impossible to ignore. He rearranged his documents to emphasize specific parts of the legislation alongside past judicial verdicts, using them as visual tools intended to reinforce his intellectual supremacy. On the opposite side of the desk, Crockett rested calmly in her deep red attire, with a golden chain reflecting the bright overhead production lighting. At 43, the Ivy League-trained lawyer had constructed her standing in a completely distinct manner. avoiding exclusive networks in favor of protecting regular citizens prior to engaging in government and subsequently securing her legislative position. Her tranquil demeanor hid an incredibly astute judicial intellect that had previously secured her multiple litigation victories against adversaries who consistently failed to recognize her true capabilities. "Good evening to you all," Crockett stated smoothly, allowing her vocal tone to carry just a hint of her Southern regional background. "Completely unlike certain individuals, I am not present to aggressively scold the American public from a place of disconnected academic privilege. I am seated here to discuss proposed laws that directly affect actual constituents, which are the very individuals I have defended within the justice system and currently champion inside the Capitol." The moderator gave a subtle nod as she detected the rapidly escalating friction between the two guests. "Let us initiate this conversation by focusing on the fundamental principles. Professor Dershowitz, you have labeled this proposed legislation an unlawful expansion of federal power, while Representative Crockett, you serve as a primary backer, so what exactly is on the line right now?" Before the Congresswoman had any opportunity to answer the query, the professor aggressively shifted his body closer to the microphone. "What hangs in the balance is absolutely nothing short of the foundational separation of governmental authority," he aggressively declared to the room. "The representative and her legislative allies desire sweeping national command over matters that the founding document explicitly delegates entirely to local state jurisdictions. This strategy is not merely terrible governance but blatantly illegal, and I remain shocked that any person holding a legal diploma could possibly endorse it." The broadcasting lens captured the lawmaker's slight grin, which signaled profound familiarity rather than any actual sense of comedic entertainment. She had previously confronted an endless stream of prosecuting attorneys and rival lawyers who deployed identical strategies, acting arrogant, patronizing, and desperate to invalidate her professional knowledge. Off camera, her staff had meticulously readied themselves for this exact behavior by studying the professor's argumentative methods, noting his habit of talking over people, projecting academic dominance, and dodging contrary points rather than addressing them head-on. What the elderly academic completely failed to comprehend was that Crockett had devoted her entire weekend to scrutinizing his historical publications, including not merely modern takes on ballot access, but older articles from the 70s and 80s that directly opposed his modern stance. She had furthermore conversed with a trio of his past Ivy League pupils who provided incredibly useful intelligence regarding his standard rhetorical patterns and intellectual vulnerabilities. Concurrently, up inside the network's production booth, the television directors observed the unfolding scene with intense scrutiny. The broadcast block was originally designed to function as a serious legislative analysis, yet the palpable interpersonal friction between the legal professionals was generating significantly more captivating entertainment. The channel's digital engagement squad started publishing short snippets of the professor's introductory statements, fully expecting that the upcoming interaction was destined to explode in popularity across the internet. The potential consequences of this face-off reached far past the simple passage of the Voting Rights Protection Act. For the Harvard scholar, the moment centered entirely around shielding his historical reputation as one of the nation's premier judicial intellects during his twilight decades. For the Texas representative, the objective was demonstrating that a fresh cohort of attorneys, rich in diversity, rooted in local struggles, and unafraid of entrenched authority, absolutely warrant equal consideration when molding the country's judicial destiny. The host physically pivoted her attention back toward the seated Congresswoman. "Representative, please provide your direct reply regarding the esteemed academic's vocalized constitutional anxieties." Crockett neatly aligned her reference materials on the desk as her facial demeanor transitioned from merely courteous to intensely concentrated. "I would be incredibly pleased to tackle those specific legal arguments, Rebecca, but initially the audience must grasp a crucial foundational element regarding this debate. What citizens truly must recognize," Crockett proceeded with a solid and resonant tone, "is that deciphering our founding charter is not a right exclusively held by elite university instructors. That power fundamentally belongs to every single citizen, particularly those individuals who are most heavily impacted by how those laws are ultimately construed. The professor arched a single brow and parted his lips to inject a comment, yet the Congresswoman relentlessly pushed forward with her statement. The academic strongly suggests that I possess a flawed grasp of constitutional jurisprudence, so let us confront that accusation head-on. The text within Article 1, Section 4 unequivocally provides the federal legislature with direct regulatory power regarding national voting procedures. The 14th and 15th Amendments additionally grant Congress the explicit authority to actively defend and secure equal access to the ballot box. This concept does not represent complex academic speculation. It is merely reading the codified statutes. The retired attorney vigorously moved his head from side to side, appearing noticeably frustrated by her remarks. Representative, I remain completely cognizant of those exact clauses, yet the highest court has continuously validated state-level dominance over electoral management, most prominently within the Shelby County versus Holder decision. I am intimately acquainted with the Shelby County ruling, Crockett answered swiftly, possessing personal experience arguing ballot access lawsuits that were immediately influenced by that specific verdict. The fundamental issue is not whether local jurisdictions hold administrative power, but whether they are permitted to weaponize that power to systematically mute the electorate. The elderly academic's facial features visibly constricted in immediate annoyance. That is exactly the type of heavily sentimental reasoning that completely obscures the core facts of this intellectual dispute. Our founding document promises identical legal shielding under the law, not guaranteed ease of access to a polling station. When electoral limitations overwhelmingly harm specific marginalized demographic groups, Crockett fired back immediately. We are no longer discussing mere ease of access, but rather blatant violations of fundamental constitutional rights. The moderator verbally stepped into the fray, suggesting they redirect their attention toward the detailed provisions located within the proposed legislation. Professor, you have publicly condemned the mandate demanding a baseline number of early electoral access days, and we would like to know your reasoning. The legal scholar shifted his upper body aggressively toward the studio camera. This exact provision represents where the federal legislature wildly exceeds its boundaries, considering that local territories vary vastly regarding their resident counts and financial capabilities. Implementing a blanket national regulation completely disregards these logistical truths while simultaneously destroying the bedrock concept of decentralized governance. I currently hold written testimonies from electoral administrators across 17 different jurisdictions who explicitly caution that these requirements will trigger absolute organizational disaster. The representative sitting across from me is shamelessly prioritizing partisan philosophy far above actual administrative feasibility. The Congresswoman paused with practiced endurance before launching her calculated rebuttal. It is incredibly fascinating that you bring up voting managers, because I possess declarations from 23 different jurisdictions, including conservative ones, backing these exact benchmarks as both realistic and necessary. She rotated her physical stance to lock eyes straight onto the Harvard professor. Let us transition into a conversation regarding your intellectual consistency, Professor. Within your published 1982 text, titled Rights of the People, you explicitly penned that national electoral benchmarks could become imperative whenever local jurisdictions demonstrate persistent prejudice or administrative collapse. You quite literally championed the exact concept of standardized nationwide early ballot access requirements within those pages. Has the supreme legal text of our nation radically altered itself over these decades, or is it merely your personal political posture that has shifted? The recording equipment perfectly captured the scholar's momentary flash of shock, as he clearly had not anticipated her weaponizing his own historical publications against him. Frantically organizing his notes, he answered that scholarly philosophy naturally develops as fresh data emerges over time. The overall environmental reality surrounding electoral procedures has drastically transformed since the 1980s era. My previously held viewpoint simply mirrored my localized anxieties regarding very particular jurisdictions during that specific historical moment. Therefore, foundational legal doctrines morph depending on the prevailing partisan atmosphere, Crockett sharply inquired. That is an exceptionally intriguing admission coming from a person who constantly markets themselves as a strict constitutional originalist. The atmospheric pressure skyrocketed as moderator Rebecca executed a conversational pivot. Let us move forward to examine the heavily debated identification mandates required at polling places. Detractors frequently argue that your proposed legislation actively deteriorates the fundamental security of our democratic contests. Those particular complainers deliberately turn a blind eye to empirical data, the Congresswoman shot back without hesitation. Numerous comprehensive analyses, featuring work from the Brennan Center, demonstrate that coordinated in-person voter deception is practically a non-existent phenomenon. What remains an undeniable reality, however, is that roughly 25 million citizens completely lack the government credentials demanded by these statutes. The Harvard emeritus let out a highly dismissive and arrogant chuckle. The Brennan Center operates with extreme bias, and proposing that vast millions of people are incapable of securing identification cards is a massive insult to the cognitive abilities of the American electorate. The Texas representative's vocal delivery instantly became noticeably more severe. Professor, I must ask if you have ever legally defended a single individual who was stripped of their ballot access simply due to lacking the financial means to purchase identification paperwork. I have personally sat down with senior citizens who entirely lack their original birth records. I have engaged in conversations with minimum wage earners who are fundamentally incapable of traveling to government credentialing facilities that strictly operate during standard business shifts. Labeling these completely legitimate systemic obstacles as mere insults perfectly illustrates that exact elite academic disconnect I referenced a few minutes ago. Realizing that his rhetorical footing was rapidly crumbling, the elderly lawyer completely changed his argumentative strategy. Your emotional personal stories absolutely cannot supersede a localized government's constitutional right to safeguard the security of its democratic processes. The highest judicial body in the land has repeatedly validated sensible identification mandates at the ballot box. In that case, let us delve deeply into those specific court decisions, the Congresswoman countered immediately. During the Crawford versus Marion County trial that sustained Indiana's identification statutes, the justices specifically pointed out that the documented proof regarding genuine constituent disenfranchisement remained remarkably sparse. However, the moment overwhelming empirical data demonstrates widespread voter suppression, the underlying judicial evaluation metrics fundamentally alter. The lawmaker confidently raised yet another printed sheet from her meticulously organized stack. Furthermore, within your 2005 piece published in the Harvard Law Review, you harshly condemned magistrates who conceal their partisan agendas beneath highly convenient interpretations of foundational legal texts. You explicitly referenced identification statutes as primary instances where local governments falsely weaponize security anxieties to secure unfair political advantages. You are intentionally ripping my words entirely out of their proper contextual framework, he defensively retorted. Am I truly doing that? The representative asked while skeptically elevating one of her brows. Would it please you if I proceeded to recite the entire printed passage aloud for the audience? The host rapidly stepped in to halt the escalating confrontation. We must momentarily pause our broadcast for a brief commercial interruption. Once we come back on the air, we will resume our analysis of ballot access legislation and accept input from our watching public. As the studio recording temporarily ceased, the professor aggressively leaned toward his assistant, frantically murmuring instructions while jabbing a finger at his reference materials. It was incredibly apparent that a major strategic miscalculation had just occurred. His terrified helper desperately rummaged through the disorganized piles of legal texts. Meanwhile, directly across the desk, the Congresswoman serenely drank from her glass of water. A studio coordinator walked over to inquire if she required any additional accommodations during the pause. "I am perfectly all right," she responded with an incredibly steady tone. "However, I strongly suggest that you assess the well-being of the esteemed academic sitting across from me. We have not even managed to arrive at his most glaring intellectual hypocrisies thus far." The moment the live transmission returned, the atmospheric dynamic within the room had noticeably transformed. The elderly attorney appeared somewhat collected but rigidly defensive. Throughout the commercial pause, I took the opportunity to examine my actual publications, rather than relying on this representative's highly curated and misleading excerpts. My consistent philosophical stance has always maintained that voting regulations must perfectly weigh constituent participation against systemic security. That is exclusively what these localized jurisdictions are attempting to accomplish, he stated while turning to look the Congresswoman square in the face. Nevertheless, since we have decided to heavily scrutinize professional backgrounds, let us be exceptionally transparent here. I have personally litigated more than 50 distinct lawsuits in front of the highest judicial bench in this country. I have instructed thousands of America's most elite legal minds on the intricacies of our nation's founding texts. With complete deference, your shockingly brief stint as a regional lawmaker and novice federal representative absolutely does not equip you with the standing to educate me regarding constitutional translation. The blatant arrogance practically dripping from his voice was impossible to ignore and served as the exact element that audiences immediately keyed in on. The Texas legislator had been patiently anticipating this exact vulnerability all evening. "Professor," she commenced with a serene yet razor-sharp delivery, employing the exact cadence she utilized during trials whenever a rival attorney committed a devastating unforced error. "I believe it is absolutely necessary that we finally confront the massive, unspoken reality dominating this conversation. The fundamental problem here," the Congresswoman continued with vocals as unyielding as iron, "is that you are hiding entirely behind your resume rather than actually dismantling the substance of my legal points. That particular intimidation tactic might succeed inside a lecture hall filled with pupils terrified of poor marks. But this stage is not an Ivy League university, and I am certainly not one of your pupils." The professor's face instantly squeezed into a tight mask of outrage. "I am absolutely engaging with the substantive issues at hand," he fired back rapidly. "You are the sole individual continually referencing ancient and irrelevant textual excerpts. I am merely demonstrating the profound ways in which your supposedly bedrock philosophies have conveniently morphed over the decades," the representative rebutted. "Let us return our attention squarely to the debate occurring right now. You aggressively insisted that local territories must maintain sweeping supremacy regarding how voting operations are conducted. However, back in the final month of 2020, you claimed that state lawmakers were not actually constrained by their own localized founding charters while selecting electoral college delegates. Implementing that specific legal theory would have effectively annihilated the democratic choices of millions of participating citizens." She dramatically elevated yet another printed document from her collection. "You personally authored a statement arguing that the foundational text assigns this exact authority exclusively to elected state lawmakers rather than to the broader state apparatus itself. How exactly do you logically align that radical posture with your sudden, bleeding heart anxiety regarding the preservation of decentralized power?" The academic visibly squirmed in his leather chair. That represented an incredibly hyper-specific judicial theory regarding the Electoral College framework, absolutely not an argument covering sweeping ballot administration standards. "Is that truly the case?" the lawmaker forcefully interrupted without missing a beat. "Both scenarios grapple with the exact same foundational dilemma of weighing decentralized government authority against the absolute necessity of defending civic participation. Nevertheless, your rigid legal analysis magically appears to transform based entirely upon whichever partisan faction stands to gain an advantage." The studio crowd released an audible wave of whispers while the retired professor's face turned completely red. "That accusation is wildly preposterous. as my philosophical stances remain rooted entirely in rigorous judicial breakdown rather than cheap partisan theater. The Texas representative offered a very brief, patronizing nod. If that is true, let us meticulously audit that specific scholarly reasoning right now. You frequently lean on the Shelby County versus Holder decision to campaign against national monitoring of localized electoral statutes. Yet within the text of that exact verdict, the leading magistrate explicitly restated the federal legislature's inherent power to combat ballot prejudice, which is the precise power this new legislation activates. She angled her body closer toward the desk separating them. The fundamental disconnect here, sir, is that I have legally advocated for the actual human beings whose lives were decimated by the fallout of the Shelby County ruling. I have personally witnessed ballot stations eliminated across marginalized neighborhoods, aggressive registration removals that statistically hammer qualified diverse demographics, and documentation mandates engineered with terrifying accuracy to lock out specific populations. The elderly scholar attempted to verbally bulldoze her, but the Congresswoman sharply elevated her palm to demand silence. I demand you allow me to finish, considering I sat quietly and paid you basic respect while you spoke. He immediately ceased talking, suddenly comprehending the severe escalation in her authoritative demeanor. You previously boasted regarding your extensive history litigating before the highest judicial body, she smoothly resumed. While I acknowledge that accomplishment, my career unfolded within local tribunals where electoral access decisions immediately dictate the trajectory of citizens' actual realities. I have actively assisted elderly individuals in recapturing their democratic voice after they were crushed by administrative red tape. Abstract legal philosophies collide violently with tangible human existence inside those courtrooms, entirely devoid of sterilized university posturing. Elevating the physical draft of the law, she stated that this proposed rule absolutely does not nationalize all electoral procedures as you falsely allege, but merely establishes baseline protections to block the most severe tactics of voter disenfranchisement. Local jurisdictions completely maintain vast administrative leeway regarding the specific logistical methods utilized to execute these baseline protections. The CNN host recognized the massive momentum shift and physically redirected the segment toward the professor. Professor, please provide your counterargument to these points. The Harvard emeritus took a moment to mentally reconstruct his shattered composure. The representative's emotional career stories remain completely valid, yet they absolutely cannot legally eclipse the founding charter, which clearly delegates the principal control of ballot administration to local territories rather than the federal branch. This aggressive legislation grossly violates those boundaries by obsessively dictating microscopic administrative processes. The 306th portion of the text by itself contains 42 highly specific directives regarding advanced ballot access schedules and geographic placements. That horrific overreach does not constitute a simple benchmark, but rather a complete governmental hijacking. A faint, victorious grin crept across the Texas lawmaker's face. I am genuinely thrilled that you specifically highlighted the 306th portion, sir. That exact segment is heavily adapted from a legislative recommendation that you personally championed during sworn committee hearings way back in 1991. You verbally characterized nearly identical interventions as perfectly scaled national maneuvers that defer to localized dominance while simultaneously guaranteeing civic participation rights. The entire broadcast studio plummeted into complete quietness as the Congresswoman held up the printed official record. This document is sourced directly from your sworn declarations to the House Judiciary Committee on the 14th of March, 1991. Would you prefer that I recite the contents aloud for the audience right now? The elderly scholar fluttered his eyelids with intense speed, looking completely and utterly ambushed. I would absolutely require the ability to examine the broader surrounding paragraphs to determine the exact contextual framing. Naturally, the lawmaker responded while casually pushing the paperwork across the desk, instructing him to take whatever duration he needed to read it. While his eyes scanned the page, The broadcast lens immortalized his facial features, melting rapidly from arrogant certainty into bewilderment, and finally settling into silent devastation. The historical record completely and undeniably verified every single claim she had just articulated. The triumphant representative pivoted her body directly toward the primary television lens. This exact scenario perfectly underscores my most profound anxiety regarding this entire debate. Far too frequently, electoral liberties are debated as abstract judicial philosophies rather than tangible legal shields that dictate the lives of actual citizens. The very academic specialists who previously cheered for national ballot protections currently fight against them, completely motivated by evolving partisan agendas rather than any actual alterations to our founding charter. Desperately attempting to salvage his dignity, the professor stuttered that even if he historically backed adjacent regulations, which he still needed to verify, the broader judicial landscape has undeniably mutated due to subsequent high court verdicts. "Which specific judicial ruling are you referring to?" she inquired with a devastatingly tranquil vocal tone. Because the Shelby County decision explicitly preserved the legislative branch's authority to obliterate ballot prejudice, demanding merely modernized evaluation metrics for federal intervention, which is exactly the mechanical function this new proposal executes using modern data. She effortlessly rotated her attention back toward the moderator. "Rebecca, the genuine dilemma here is not some theoretical legal debate, but rather answering if every single citizen inherently merits identical democratic access, regardless of their geographic location, daily working hours, or physical limitations. The historical legacy and explicit wording of our highest laws unequivocally saddle the federal legislature with the moral and legal obligation to intervene whenever that democratic participation faces peril." The academic, appearing incredibly rattled, aimlessly moved his documents around while the studio crowd observed the destruction in absolute quiet. Earlier, the professor had charged the Congresswoman with prioritizing sentimental arguments far above rigorous judicial reasoning. Elevating a brow in a mocking fashion, she openly questioned if that was truly the case. If so, let us dive aggressively into the hyper-specific mechanical depths of this legal justification. The fourth section of the first article undeniably declares that the scheduling, geographic placement, and execution methods of federal contests will be established by local lawmakers. Yet it also guarantees that the national legislature retains absolute authority to implement or modify these rules whenever it desires. This exact phrasing provides the federal branch with supreme and undeniable dominance over the entire procedure. Additionally, she articulated that the 14th Amendment's equality guarantees, alongside the 15th Amendment's prohibition against demographic prejudice at the ballot box, both feature execution provisions granting federal lawmakers the concrete power to draft necessary protective statutes. The highest judicial bench has continuously defended this specific authority, most notably during the Brnovich versus DNC case, which, despite maintaining Arizona's local statutes, strongly reiterated the federal government's legal right to establish national ballot access baselines. A deep hush blanketed the room while the representative systematically destroyed every single one of the academic's legal complaints, referencing past rulings, historical events, and microscopic details of the proposed law with terrifying accuracy. This entire display served as an elite masterclass in judicial philosophy, taught not through detached academic posturing, but forged within the fires of actual courtroom combat. The Harvard emeritus desperately tried to inject himself into her monologue multiple times, but the Texas lawmaker effortlessly deflected his attacks, projecting a vastly superior mastery of both the foundational texts and the new legislation's mechanics. His rapidly expanding rage and embarrassment were completely impossible to conceal. Eventually, in a final desperate maneuver, he deployed what he foolishly considered to be his most devastating counterattack. "Representative, with all appropriate deference, I strongly suspect you completely fail to grasp the disastrous accidental fallout triggered by your own proposed laws. The 502nd segment could theoretically dilute the democratic influence of marginalized communities within highly localized contests. The Congresswoman's smirk expanded into a visibly gleeful expression. "My esteemed academic colleague, I deeply regret to inform you that your assertion is factually wrong. There is absolutely zero text labeled as the 502nd segment within this entire legislative proposal. The entire drafted document caps out at a total of 428 separate portions." The broadcasting space instantly dropped into a state of absolute, paralyzed silence. The panicked lawyer frantically tore through his notes, comprehending far too late that he had accidentally mixed up the current proposal with an entirely different draft, representing a catastrophic blunder for any person marketing themselves as a subject matter authority. "I offer my regrets," he muttered with a severely diminished vocal volume, "as I originally intended to reference the 402nd segment." The Congresswoman replied without missing a beat, noting that the specific portion he just named exclusively regulates secure ballot collection containers. That section contains absolutely zero language concerning the dilution of marginalized demographic electoral power. It is highly probable that your mind is wandering back to House Resolution 2722 from the previous legislative session, which operated as a completely unconnected legal maneuver. This brutally humiliating interaction perfectly summarized the broader dynamic that had defined the entire evening. Regardless of his towering resume, the elderly professor had marched onto the set without bothering to actually read the proposed text, choosing instead to lean lazily on pre-written political talking points. Conversely, the representative, having personally authored chunks of the document, showcased profound comprehension and lethal precision throughout every single rebuttal. Recognizing the monumental gravity of this televised destruction, the CNN anchor immediately rotated to face the defeated scholar. "Professor, considering the devastating corrections provided by the lawmaker, do you possess any desire to walk back your previously stated condemnations regarding any part of this law?" With his legendary arrogance completely shattered, he mumbled that while he maintained theoretical legal anxieties, he openly confessed that several of his attacks were rooted in obsolete or factually bankrupt intelligence. "I will genuinely require additional time to scrutinize the actual written text more rigorously." The victorious lawmaker offered a polite, remarkably elegant nod of acknowledgement. "I value your admission, sir, and I would be delighted to provide you with a comprehensive breakdown proving exactly how every single provision harmonizes perfectly with historical judicial rulings. Ideally, we can ultimately find common ground regarding the absolute necessity of shielding the democratic voice of every single citizen in this nation." Her remarkably poised and forgiving vocal delivery perfectly highlighted the massive gulf separating the two figures, exposing one desperately holding on to a fading legacy, while the other stood firmly upon massive intellect and real-world combat. Once the broadcast concluded, it remained blatantly obvious to millions of viewers that they had just watched a historical pivot point within the country's judicial discourse, permanently establishing that ancient resumes could no longer substitute for actual subject mastery. Practically seconds after the televised block finished broadcasting, short videos featuring the lawmaker's surgical destruction of her opponent completely saturated digital platforms everywhere. The most explosive snippet, showcasing her brutal exposure of the academic's fabricated 502nd section, skyrocketed past 1 million plays in less than 60 minutes. Search terms relating to the Congresswoman's fierce retaliation and the completely imaginary legislative section instantly dominated national internet trends. Media personalities representing every single point on the political spectrum immediately offered their shocked reactions to the bloodbath. Right-leaning judicial pundit Andrew McCarthy published a statement declaring that, completely independent of anyone's personal feelings regarding the proposed law, the representative had just delivered an absolute clinic on professional readiness. The Harvard emeritus arrived armed with vague posturing, while his opponent brought lethal, hyper-targeted facts, Progressive Network anchor Rachel Maddow kicked off her evening broadcast by stating that the public had just watched a judicial replication of the David and Goliath myth. Except this modern iteration featured ruthless intellectual accuracy rather than a simple weapon. Off-camera inside the television network's headquarters, directors who originally expected a dry legislative chat were frantically scrambling to monetize what rapidly transformed into the channel's highest-rated block of the entire calendar cycle. During the late hours, staff assembled an exclusive broadcast block focused upon emerging advocates altering the judicial landscape, featuring the Texas representative as the absolute centerpiece of the coverage. Sitting inside his lavish New York City residence, the elderly professor was forced to process one of the most humiliating public defeats of his extraordinarily lengthy professional life. His mobile device vibrated relentlessly, flooded with inquiries from academic peers, former pupils, and reporters desperate to secure a reactionary quote. Inside the Ivy League University's digital forums, faculty members ignited furious discussions regarding the televised massacre, with multiple instructors gleefully pointing out that the lawmaker had weaponized the exact same aggressive questioning techniques the professor historically inflicted upon his own classes. By the time the sun rose, the defeated scholar officially published a written declaration. Although I maintain severe legal anxieties concerning nationalized ballot statutes, I fully acknowledge the representative's overwhelmingly powerful grasp of the subject matter. Our national civic dialogue massively profits whenever exceptionally readied champions step forward to defend their respective ideological positions. Despite its highly polite phrasing, the political sphere universally interpreted the message as a desperate maneuver to halt the bleeding of his professional reputation. Conversely, the fallout surrounding the viral moment proved completely life-altering for the young representative. Her congressional staff found themselves buried underneath a mountain of media appearances from massive broadcasters, while her digital audience metrics multiplied by a factor of 3 before the next morning. Noting her skyrocketing cultural power, elite liberal lawmakers practically begged her to spearhead a massive media briefing regarding the ballot access laws the very next afternoon. Even more shockingly, a trio of previously hesitant legislators directly telephoned her headquarters to formally announce their newfound endorsement of the proposed rules. The massive alteration in legislative velocity was entirely impossible to ignore or deny. A statutory initiative that initially looked doomed to fail suddenly emerged as a highly plausible victory. Extensive breakdowns of the televised slaughter exploded across judicial websites and university discussion boards everywhere. One prominent Ivy League instructor published an essay arguing that the Texas lawmaker proved that combining real-world struggles with deep academic rigor generates vastly superior judicial analyses compared to relying entirely on sterilized philosophical theories. Shortly thereafter, an elite Washington university scheduled a live forum specifically designed to examine the rapidly fading value of fancy resumes when confronted by overwhelming factual competence during civic debates. Major advocacy groups immediately capitalized upon the intense cultural momentum generated by the broadcast. Prominent equality organizations released public memos highlighting exactly how the representative's devastating televised performance perfectly reinforced the legal bedrock justifying national ballot defense measures. On-the-ground organizers across multiple battleground states documented massive spikes in citizen recruitment for Democratic participation campaigns, with countless new volunteers explicitly naming the lawmakers' fiery television appearance as their primary motivation. Right-wing broadcasting networks desperately attempted to alter the overwhelming cultural storyline. A highly prominent conservative television anchor claimed that the Congresswoman's brutal fact-check regarding the imaginary legislative segment did nothing to invalidate the larger philosophical concerns at play. However, even the judicial analysts employed by that specific right-leaning network openly confessed that the Harvard emeritus suffered a catastrophic defeat regarding the actual facts of the debate. A former magistrate bluntly stated on live television that the elderly scholar leaned entirely on his historical fame, whereas his opponent relied exclusively on lethal, meticulous readiness. Exactly 72 hours following the brutal broadcasting event, a completely shocking twist materialized behind the scenes. The humiliated academic formally asked for a completely secluded face-to-face sit-down with the Texas representative inside her governmental workspace. The famous lawyer showed up to the appointment completely by himself, intentionally leaving behind any media presence or personal assistance. Representative, he initiated the conversation, employing a vocal cadence that was drastically more humble than his aggressive televised posturing. I have finally taken the appropriate amount of time to exhaustively read the drafted legislation from cover to cover. Although I continue to harbor anxieties regarding highly specific mechanisms within the text, I am forced to concede that your fundamental judicial logic was incredibly robust. He hesitated for a moment before admitting that her arguments focusing heavily upon the tangible consequences inflicted upon everyday citizens resonated deeply with him. Abstract intellectual posturing remains practically worthless unless it survives contact with actual human reality. The lawmaker, displaying massive elegance following her victory, asked the professor to jointly write an editorial piece exploring their mutual foundational beliefs regarding ballot access, despite their methodological disagreements. The American electorate absolutely needs proof that deciphering our founding documents does not inherently require toxic partisan warfare, she wisely posited to the older man. Following a brief period of internal contemplation, the Harvard scholar accepted her incredible offer. Their collaborative essay, published within a major national newspaper, exploded in popularity. But this time it succeeded because it beautifully showcased highly productive conversations, bridging massive generational and philosophical divides. The powerful article ended by declaring that whenever arguments prioritize actual facts above fancy resumes and empirical data above historical prestige, our civic systems flourish beautifully. For the Texas representative, the nationally televised bloodbath served as an absolutely critical turning point, turbocharging both her political trajectory and her overarching crusade to champion desperately ignored topics. During the 7 days immediately following her studio demolition of the academic, she secured highly coveted speaking requests from the most elite university legal programs in the entire nation. Registration for academic classes focusing heavily upon democratic ballot access exploded at universities across the entire country during the subsequent academic term. Most profoundly, the lawmaker collected thousands of letters from novice attorneys, university pupils, and particularly diverse female legal professionals who permanently viewed her as a massive icon of academic bravery. You brilliantly demonstrated that we never need to shrink our actual lived realities simply to confront entrenched institutional dominance, one Midwestern University pupil wrote in a deeply emotional note. Back inside the nation's capital, the massive legislative shockwaves continued rippling outward. A trio of conservative members of the upper legislative chamber directly contacted her to negotiate a highly plausible bipartisan deal concerning advanced ballot access benchmarks. Even though ideological friction remained, the conversations fundamentally transitioned away from abstract legal philosophy and moved directly toward tangible fixes, which was precisely the arena where the Congresswoman dominated. During a private caucus gathering, a senior lawmaker explicitly told her that she did more than merely conquer an argument, noting that she permanently altered the framework of the entire conversation, which operates as the very foundation of permanent cultural shifts. Exactly a month and a half later, an updated iteration of the electoral defense legislation cleared the lower chamber, with votes secured from both sides of the political aisle. Although its ultimate fate inside the upper chamber remained entirely unknown, the statutory proposal possessed a level of massive velocity that nobody could have predicted prior to her explosive television appearance. Political forecasters universally praised her for completely rewiring how the American electorate comprehends both the high-level judicial philosophies and the brutal on-the-ground realities regarding democratic access. Across the broader journalistic ecosystem, the televised clash transformed into a mandatory lesson plan examining exactly how the definition of intellectual supremacy is rapidly shifting within modern civic debates. Elite resumes undoubtedly still carried weight, yet they absolutely failed to automatically crush meticulous readiness and the undeniable power of real-world suffering and triumph. A completely fresh era of thinkers forcefully demanded respect based exclusively on their intellectual lethality and rigorous work ethics, rather than relying on their fancy institutional associations. For the millions of citizens watching from their homes, the brutal encounter delivered an incredibly scarce instance of authentic, high-stakes philosophical warfare broadcast live over the airwaves. The event completely shattered standard partisan boundaries and illuminated a much more profound element regarding the perpetual national struggle over who legitimately wields power inside a republic, whether inside a voting booth or during a televised debate. While privately reviewing the tape with her staff days later, the lawmaker insisted that her goal was absolutely never centered around publicly humiliating the elderly academic. The actual objective was constantly focused on guaranteeing that every single citizen's fundamental right to engage in their government remains shielded by both high-minded legal rulings and brutal logistical realities. The precise intersection where abstract judicial philosophy violently collides with actual human survival is exactly where true fairness is forged. The televised bloodbath between the two legal minds would eventually become mandatory curriculum across university programs everywhere, operating as the flawless historical example of how lethal readiness, hyper-specific competence, and righteous fury can successfully obliterate entrenched power structures. The moment violently reminded the entire nation that inside a functioning republic, arguments must survive entirely upon their own structural integrity, rather than relying upon the arrogant titles held by the people shouting them. As the ferocious war regarding electoral access raged on across the country, one massive reality became completely inescapable. A highly lethal new warrior had permanently stormed the national battlefield, proving definitively that the absolute best counterattack to arrogant bullying remains extreme self-assurance, terrifying preparation, and unflinching bravery. If you discovered massive value within this detailed dissection of the brutal televised clash, please remember to aggressively smash that like button and subscribe to our network, as we consistently deliver the most explosive governmental encounters while analyzing their massive shockwaves across the country. So ring that alert bell to ensure you never miss our newest breakdowns.